Hi, everybody. Welcome to our Research Like a Pro with DNA question and answer series. And for today's question, we have how to use Banyan DNA to find a match's place in the tree. And I'm also going to mention that Banyan DNA and What Are the Odds, WATO, can be used as diagramming tools. And we've been working in the study group this week on diagramming and creating a diagram of close matches. And we often use Lucidchart or diagrams.net, but you can also use these tools, especially if you already have a subscription to DNA Painter where WATO is hosted, and you can have multiple trees there. But it's also very useful for helping you find where a match without a tree belongs in your descendancy diagram. So let's talk about how you can do that. Here is the descendancy diagram that I am currently working on creating in Lucidchart for my research project. And for my project, I'm working on finding the descendants of Lucinda's siblings. And so I'm going to focus on her brother, James, um, James Keaton. And I have a couple of his children from documentary evidence, but I know he had a bunch more that I haven't been able to find yet. So that's my research objective. Well, for this assignment, it's about mapping out your close matches in a diagram. And so I'm using the test taker who I will call Jack. And all of these test takers' names are changed and anonymized. So with Jack's matches, where he's not myself or my mom, he's one of our cousins, I wanted to just get a handle on his close matches. So I was working on adding all these green people I added to my tree as matches. And then I got to a person who shared about 200 centimorgans with Jack, but I couldn't find where he goes in the diagram because he didn't have a tree. And so his name is Anthony. I'll call him Anthony. And he didn't have a tree. He didn't have any clues on his profile about his age or where he lived, just kind of had nothing, except for the fact that his test is managed by someone. And the name there didn't really mean anything. It was a username. So with the Pro Tools shared matches, I thought maybe I could see who his closest matches were. So by default, this shared matches page is sorted by the test taker's matches. So the shared matches will be in order by the ones that are closest to Jack. But we actually want to sort it by Anthony's closest matches. So going to sort, you can then choose to sort by Anthony's close to distant matches. And then we will have them in order right here. Instead of starting with 26, we'll start with his closest centimorgans match and then going down. So after doing that, we now have all of Anthony's closest matches listed from closest to more distant. So this is extremely helpful for figuring out Anthony's place in the tree and how he's related to Jack. And so first I noticed that the closest match of Anthony's is Kevin, and he is either a half-brother or nephew, according to Ancestry's estimate, to Anthony. And so Kevin and Anthony are going to be either half-brothers or nephews or uncles or something similar to that. So also, Orville has a tree, and Orville is either a grandnephew or a half-nephew. Belle is also a close relative, a half-sister or niece, but doesn't have a tree. So we're going to work with the trees of Kevin and Orville and the amount of shared DNA and see if we can figure out where Anthony belongs in the tree. So these relationship predictions from Ancestry are not showing you everything. So right here on the page, we saw half-brother or nephew. So Anthony is Kevin's half-brother or nephew, and then Orville and Anthony are grandnephew or half-nephew. So it gives you the top two. And it takes into account the age of the individuals, the self-reported age that they give to Ancestry. It doesn't tell you their age, but it supposedly incorporates that. And it also uses the genders of both people, and then it tries to predict the most likely relationships. So it shows you the first two here and on that shared matches page. And then if you click on the frequency of relationships, so clicking right here on this blue text will open up additional relationships. And so here we can see that Anthony and Kevin are going to be either nephew, uncle relationships to each other, which are genetically equivalent. And then they could also be half brothers, or they could be grandfather and grandson. Now, because of the tree, we know I can just kind of tell that um, Anthony could not be the grandfather of Kevin because I already know Kevin's grandfather. So looking at the tree, I'll show you in a second, but he can't be the granduncle or great grandfather or grandfather of Kevin based on the age of Kevin's known grandfather. So he wouldn't have been able to take a DNA test if he was his grandfather because he died much before DNA testing began. There's a much higher chance that these are the relationships and then a lower chance that these are the relationships. And so this is really helpful. And then between Anthony and Orville, there's a lot of other possible relationships. So since there are fewer of these, we'll focus on Anthony and Kevin. And Kevin is in our tree right here as a descendant of Sophie Elmina Harris Fraser. And Orville is also a descendant of Sophie. And Jack is a descendant of Margaret, which is Sophie's sister. So we know that probably Anthony will be a descendant of Sophie because his two closest matches are on Sophie's branch. So because these two are the closest matches, we're going to focus in on them. Now, the other person who we saw who doesn't have a tree is Belle. And Belle is a smaller match with Jack, but she's really close with Anthony and with Kevin. And if we sort by her closest matches, we can see that she's either a half sibling or niece, aunt, or uncle nephew relationship with Anthony. And Belle is probably a first cousin with Kevin. So we might also try to place Belle in Sophie's branch of the tree here somewhere. So it looks like Belle and Anthony probably belong in the descendancy of Sophie because of their closest matches with Orville and Kevin. Orville is a little bit lower down on the list here with Belle, but he does share 180 centimorgans with Belle. So what can I do with all this information? How can I tell where Anthony and Belle fall in Sophie's tree? Where do they fall here? I know a lot of the shared match information and how much they share with these people and with Jack and with each other, but it's kind of a lot of information to process on my own. Well, this is where we can use Banyan DNA. And Banyan DNA has kind of two really awesome features. And one of them is hypothesis testing, and the other is validation of your tree. So if you think you have a guess where these individuals fit in the tree, and then you put it in and you say calculate and validate if this is correct, then it will give you some scores and tell you if these relationships are most likely or not. If you have some hypotheses and you want to check which one is the most likely, you can put in all those hypotheses and then you can calculate that. And then not even something that Banyan DNA professes to be for, but also helpful, is just diagramming. If you already use Banyan DNA because it's helpful for you with the hypothesis testing and with the multiple relationships and the pedigree collapse, which it's known for, then you can also use it for diagramming because it's really, really good at that. Well, I went ahead and put in what I know about Sophie's line. So I put in Orville as a descendant of Sophie and Kevin. Then I put in Jack, my test taker, as a descendant of Melissa Harris. Then I put in the amounts of shared DNA between all of these people. And then I wanted to go ahead and add my hypothesis, which I want to find out where Anthony belongs in this tree. In Banyan, you click on the Person of Interest tab, and then you put in the match data. So I'm going to click that tab, and then I'm going to put in how much DNA I know Anthony and Kevin share based on the Shared Matches Pro Tools tab, and it's 2,095. And then I'm going to put that in for how much he also shares with Orville and with Jack. Now that I've done that, I'm going to add some hypotheses for where Anthony could fit. So some of the different places where he could fit were like half sibling and uncle nephew and a bunch of those. So I put in all of those different hypotheses, and that took a little while, but I looked at this list of all the different relationships and remembered that I crossed off grandfather, granduncle and great-grandfather, because as you can see right here is Kevin, and Kevin's mother is Irene, and Kevin's grandfather is Otto. And Otto died in 1967. So Anthony can't be Otto because he died in 1967. So I didn't include some of these older people hypotheses, but I did put in nephew. So you can see here's if Anthony is a nephew, that would be my hypothesis 3. And grandnephew, first cousin, uncle, half brother, and half nephew. In Banyan DNA, it was a little tricky for me to figure this out. I had to look it up in the documentation for Banyan, but in order to add a half sibling, you have to add another parent, and you have to connect the lines to the other parent. After doing that, I had all my hypotheses based on my list, and then I could run a calculation. So go to new, calculation, then change it from validation over to hypothesis calculation. And then I named this one Anthony's Place in the Tree. Since I'm on a free account at Banyan, I can only have one saved calculation at a time, so I took screenshots of them. Then click Run, and here is the results. So all of these different hypotheses, here's 3, all of them have a relative probability. And as you can see, most of them are 0, but there's 2 that are above 0, which is hypothesis 4, where we have a half-sibling relationship between Kevin and Anthony, and then hypothesis 9, where Anthony is the uncle of Kevin. So both of those were above 0, but hypothesis 9 was much higher with 99. So let's go through how this works. So if you click on the arrow down, then you can see the results for that hypothesis. And so for hypothesis 4, where Anthony is Kevin's half brother, we can see that the score for each relationship is given. And the one that made this hypothesis not work very well was the relationship between Orville and hypothesis 4, where Anthony was the half sibling. And if Anthony was Kevin's half brother and was in that spot in the tree, he would have been a second cousin with Orville, but they share 726 centimorgans, which is above the amount you would expect for a second cousin. From the shared centimorgan project, we can see the range only goes to 592. And the range that Banyan gives you is actually the 1 standard deviation above and below the mean. So this isn't the full range, but the 1 standard deviation range. So I decided this one could be eliminated because if Orville and Anthony were second cousins, they wouldn't share this much. So it must be a different relationship between Orville and Anthony. So this one is not really likely. Then the other one, hypothesis 3, where Anthony was Kevin's nephew in the tree, that one made more sense. Oh, no, this isn't the right one. If Anthony is Kevin's nephew, this one is not possible either, because Orville would be a second cousin once removed, but he shares way too much DNA to be even further away. So this one's wrong too. And then another one that's wrong is Anthony is Kevin's grandson. And that one doesn't work because then he would be even further away from Orville, second cousin twice removed, but still he shares so much. Wrong. Now we get to the correct one. This one is the 99% chance. If Anthony is Kevin's uncle, all these relationships work. So Kevin would be the nephew of Anthony, and Orville would be a first cousin once removed, and Jack would be a second cousin. So this one works. So now in Banyan, I can say that this is where Anthony belongs. If you right click on it, click Solve POI or Person of Interest here, and then you can choose the option to have all the other hypotheses deleted. And now you just see that Anthony belongs here in the tree. So that was fun. Then I thought I would try to, first I thought I would add him to my tree in my lucid chart diagram. So I used a dotted line to indicate that it was still tentative, even though it's a 99% chance. And then I thought I would go on to Belle. So can I find out where Belle belongs in this tree as well, now that I know where Anthony probably goes? And Anthony and Belle are really closely related, sharing 1,809 centimorgans. And so the different relationships that they have could be like a half sibling relationship, a niece, nephew, aunt, uncle relationship, grandchild, grandparent relationship, and then some of these others that aren't as likely. So once again, I put these into um, Banyan. I added a new person of interest, and then I added several hypotheses for where she could fit. Half sister to Anthony, first cousin to Anthony, since Anthony was her closest relationship. First cousin once removed, half niece, granddaughter, and niece. Then I ran the calculation for the hypothesis, and I got three of these hypotheses as possible. And so let's look at each one. Where Belle is Anthony's half sister, this one has only a 1% chance, and that's because of this amount here being a little bit too low, and this amount here being a little bit too low. They're below the range of one standard deviation. So that's why it gets this lower possibility. And so you can see that although I was placing the hypotheses based on Belle being a half sibling, it also takes into account all the relationships with Belle and Jack, Belle and Kevin, and Belle and Orville, because I added the amount of shared DNA between Belle and all these people. So this one's probably wrong, but the next one has a 76% chance. And so I gave it a possible, like a question mark. And the one that was a little bit off is the relationship between Jack and Belle if they're second cousins once removed, sharing 22. That's a little low, but still it's within the possibility. And so it has the highest chance of being correct because all these closer relationships are spot on. And you can see that when they have a 0 in the number of standard deviations, that means it's within one standard deviation. If it's a 1.0 or above, that means it's more than one standard deviation away from the average or mean. So the next one, and the last one, is the 23% because the others all had a 0. And this one is where Belle is Anthony's granddaughter. And I thought this was probably a little bit less likely, but it's still possible just because a lot of DNA test takers are closer in age. But there are some younger people taking DNA tests just for fun, even though they're not really doing it to learn their ancestors. They just want to see their ethnicity. But some of them are taking it. But you know, when I decided to do DNA, I didn't test myself for that purpose. I tested my grandparents. So I always wonder, like, if a young person's taking a test, it's probably just for fun to see their ethnicity. But anyway, this one was not as likely because with Kevin and Belle sharing 779 centimorgans, and the average for a first cousin once removed is 427, this is a little on the higher range. It would be a little too high, but it's still within the range of possibility because a first cousin once removed from the shared centimorgan project has been seen to share up to 980. So this one's less likely for that reason, but still possible. So looking at my Lucid chart diagram, I could add Belle either right here as Anthony's granddaughter or right here as Anthony's niece. Now, after doing this, I decided to go ahead and add in a couple more known matches that match Belle and Jack, and I added them to my Banyan DNA diagram and ran the calculation again, and I got a little bit of a higher result for hypothesis 2, where Belle is the niece of Anthony and the first cousin of Kevin. So if I had to put her in the diagram, I'd probably put her here. And ultimately, it's not super important for my research question because my research question is 2 generations further back, but I am happy to know that Belle probably belongs here because I can then use her in finding more matches and looking at her shared matches list and understand kind of where she belongs in the tree. So you might be wondering the difference between Banyan DNA and WATO. What are the odds, which is hosted at DNA Painter. And one thing that is different and really nice at WATO is that it can automatically suggest hypotheses, which is really helpful because at Banyan I had to put them in myself, which was a little harder. But Banyan is really excellent because it can analyze the shared DNA between any 2 people in the tree, not just the matches of one target person. So if I was using WATO, I could only put in the amount of DNA that Jack shares with everybody because that's whose test I was looking at. But with with Banyan, I can put in how much Jack shares with everyone and how much Belle shared with everyone and Anthony shared with everyone. And I could run a validation on that. And then I can run a hypothesis on two different people. So it just gave me a lot more flexibility to figure out where people belong in my tree and not have to like make new WATO diagrams. So, and then of course, Banyan DNA, what they're really known for is for being able to analyze complex family trees with pedigree collapse and more than one most recent common ancestral couple and multiple relationships. So, if you're thinking about using Banyan and you want to try combining that with the power of Ancestry Pro Tools shared matches, where you can see how much everyone shares with each other, this is a really great thing to do. And it is a bit more advanced. So, if you've never used Banyan or WATO, maybe wait to use it until we get to the lesson about DNA tools. But I thought it was really useful in this assignment where I wanted to figure out where people belonged in my tree. If you want to read more about the differences between Banyan DNA and WATO, go to Leah Larkin's blog, The DNA Geek, and she has a post called Power Up Your DNA Analyses, where she talks about using Ancestry Pro Tools shared matches along with Banyan DNA. Thanks. I hope that was helpful.